Well, welcome everyone. We are cranking through the scroll of Samuel and working through the book of 1 Samuel. And tonight we're going to be looking at the exploits of David, starting with his anointment as king and going all the way through him being out with his band of merry men out in the wilderness. But we're going to do things a little bit differently today. But before we do that, let's open in a word of prayer. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we have been blessed with to come and study your word. We thank you for the accessibility of the Holy Scriptures in a language we can understand, Lord. We thank you for the safety that we have here at the church to come and to worship you through study of your Scriptures. Lord, we ask that you would bless this time, that your Spirit will be upon us to give us new insight and understanding, and that you would shape our hearts and our minds so that we might be able to humble ourselves before you and be obedient to you in all things. And so, Father, we give this time to you, and we pray this all. Now, we're going to do things a little bit differently because in your reading for this week, we covered probably one of the most well-known stories in the Bible, David and Goliath. It's a story that we teach our children. Steve, I don't know if you have taught that in your Sunday school class, but even as early as fourth grade, I'm sure that even the preschoolers have done something with that story. And so it's really well known, but because it's really well known, it's one of those stories that often goes under the radar because we know what happens, right? And so we don't really need to read that passage very closely because, well, we already know what happens. At least this is what I have found to be the case. And so we're going to dig pretty deeply into the story of David and Goliath tonight. But to do that, I've got 4 questions here on the board to get us kind of priming the pump as we think about that. And so what I would like you to do is to turn to your neighbor, or in groups of 2 or 3, you might have to move around a little bit, and based on your reading of the story and what you remember, to answer these 4 questions, because each one is going to get at something that we're going to think about a little bit more deeply in our time tonight. So you go ahead and break up however you want for about, we'll say 10 minutes, maybe not quite that long, and discuss these 4 questions and what the answers are. And if you can't read what I've written because it's either too sloppy or you're too far away, I'm going to read them out loud so that you have them. Though if you're too far away, that's on you. So the first question is, does Saul know David? Does he know who he is in this story? The second question is, why did David reject the sword and the armor of Saul when he said he was going to go out to fight the Philistine, to fight Goliath? Why did he reject the sword? Number 3, what happens if Israel loses this battle? And then number 4, what are the political ramifications of David beating Goliath? So, does Saul know David? Why did David reject the sword and armor of Saul? What happens if Israel loses this battle? And what are the David winning against Goliath? Go. Beth, we're breaking into groups and answering these 4 questions. Holly, you'll just have to discuss with Abraham. And while they're working, and if you're joining online, you can also type in any questions that you or answers that you have into the chat, and Aaron will keep track of those. And that's also a good way to let us know that you're here. To the people of Israel. Yeah, not to the Philistines. It's a pretty open-ended question, isn't it? So, yeah, it's almost like the author of the question purposely made it that way. All right, we're going to work for about another 3 minutes, and then we'll come back together. All right, another 30 seconds, and then we'll come on back together. All righty, if we could bring it back to wherever we want to be sitting. Isn't this fun? We're going to get to your group's answers in just a bit, but I do want to just bring us up to speed from where we left off last week. So if you remember, in chapter 15, we had an interaction between Samuel and Saul, where Samuel basically said, the Lord has made up his mind that you are not going to remain king in Israel. And why was that? He offered the sacrifice of what? Pardon me? No, well, he did do that. So that was earlier, where he did build a monument to himself. So we had one instance earlier on where Saul was waiting for Samuel to show up to do an offering to find out if they should go and fight against the Philistines, but Samuel wasn't showing up, and people were starting to desert the army, and so he did sacrifices for himself. And Samuel said, "The Lord is not going to establish your kingdom forever. If you had obeyed and done, then I would have established your kingdom forever, but I'm not going to anymore." And then in chapter 15, we had another occurrence. God sent Saul to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites, right? And did he? Right, he kept the best animals and plunder for himself, and then he went and built a monument to himself up on Mount Carmel, and then he also didn't kill the king. He kept the king alive. And so Samuel comes and says, why didn't you obey what God said? And Saul said, well, I was going to, but I wanted to offer sacrifices to the Lord, which on the surface seems like, all right, yeah, he didn't obey, but it seems like his heart was in the right place, right? But as we read, we find out that that wasn't actually the case. Why didn't he utterly destroy everything? Exactly. We find out later that he repents of his sin, and we find out that he actually kept the livestock because he was afraid of his own men. He was afraid that they would riot or leave or usurp him when he utterly destroyed all the stuff. They fought for him and died for him, but they didn't get to keep any of the plunder. And so he was afraid of the repercussions of that, and so he allows some of the best stuff to be kept under the pretext of offering to God. And that's where we find a lot of the character of Saul. Even though he looks like a great king, and even if he might be a good military leader, he's actually kind of a spineless weasel, right? Who won't even stand up to his own men, is constantly afraid of losing his position and authority, which, when you think about it, makes sense. Why was he chosen? Well, there's not really a good reason. I mean, he looks like a good warrior, but that's about it. Remember, he's from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest tribe that almost got wiped out, from the town of Gibeah, which, if you remember the story of the Levite's concubine, that's the same people, right? And so he's from the smallest tribe with the least political power. The Benjaminites did. Among the 12 tribes, Benjamin was at the very, very bottom. And so you can understand, for someone who's been thrust into this position, is now trying to lead a nation that used to be 12 nations and had just come under one roof under his reign, that he might be a little afraid of someone coming and usurping his power, afraid of losing control of his army and being killed. It's understandable, but he's living into that. He's not standing up against that and trusting in the Lord to do that. He's not humbling himself before the Lord. Instead, he's puffing himself up to make himself look better, which, by the way, going back to the monument, is that just because he's a prideful guy? Well, part of that might be, but also by creating monuments, that's actually propaganda, right? He's trying to make himself look big so that news of what he's done spreads around all of Israel, and he can more solidify his own role. This is pretty common. If we look at the Egyptians, the Egyptian kings would do this. In fact, we know the most about a group called the Hyksos, which were an invasionary tribe during the Bronze Age collapse. The only reason we really know anything about them is because the pharaoh in Egypt basically made a giant propaganda stele that talked about how he was the best and no one else could beat these invaders, but he was the one who stood against them, even though archaeological evidence shows that he barely escaped by the skin of his teeth. He made it sound like he was the best thing in the world because, of course, he won, and he wants to solidify his rule. And so we see Saul doing all of that. But because he disobeyed the Lord, not once, but twice, because he showed himself to be a spineless coward, while also being arrogant and prideful and doing what was wicked, God says, I'm going to take the kingdom from you and give it to somebody else. And who does he give it to? David. And so that's where we read in chapter 16, which we're just kind of going to breeze over, but we are going to make some note of some things. Remember, our themes are chapter 2, that God raises up the lowly, the humble, the poor, the weak, but he brings down the arrogant and the wicked and the strong. He's the great equalizer. And we saw that with Saul. When Saul was chosen to be king, God didn't choose the most powerful tribe. He chose the weakest tribe and the smallest clan within that tribe. And again, we see a similar thing happening with David. David is one of the sons of Jesse, and Samuel is sent to Jesse. And one thing I want to make note of, it's very interesting. So I'm just going to be reading from the beginning of chapter 16, starting in verse 4. God's just sent Samuel to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse. Verse 4. Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling, and they said, "Do you come peaceably?" Why? Right, so what's happened directly before this? Samuel what? Right, Samuel killed the king right after he did what? Said, I'm going, relayed the words of God that I'm going to take your kingdom and give it to someone else, right? Was that a public thing? Like, do you think that was a private conversation? There's nothing in the text in chapter 15 that makes it seem like it's private. It seems like Saul's going and greeting, and he's got his entourage. He's probably got his top commanders and things like that, their servants and all kinds of gossipers, right? And there's this interaction where Saul's trying to make himself look good in front of the prophet, the man of God, again, because he's trying to solidify power. And so remember, this is what it says in chapter 15. Samuel rose early, this is verse 12. Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and Samuel is told Saul went up to Carmel, where he set up a monument for himself, and on returning he passed down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "May the Lord be blessed by you. I have carried out the commandment of the Lord." And so, it seems like Saul is going forward, and he's in earshot of everybody, talking about how great he is because he obeyed God, right? That certainly wouldn't be out of character for what we know about Saul, which means this interaction is probably a public interaction where Samuel says, God's going to take the kingdom from you and give to someone else. So that's the backdrop. You think people know about this? You think that's spreading around the people of Israel? That would be like headline news, right? That your first king, the one that you asked for, that God made king over you, God's now said, nope, I don't like this guy anymore, someone else is. Why? Not just is that headline news, but why would that be even more headline news? Is the crown going to go to Jonathan, his son, like any other hereditary kingship would be? It doesn't seem like that, which means who's it going to? Well, it could be anybody, right? Which means now we have all of the 12 tribes of Israel with an opportunity for them to get their guy, one of their tribes, as the primary leadership, which comes with all of the prestige. Remember, the capital is now in Benjamin. All of the fighting forces are there with Saul in Benjamin. Benjamin went from being the least tribe to now the most important tribe with all of the political power. And now the question is, well, is there going to be a power vacuum, and can we grab at that? You think that's going through the minds of anybody in Israel? You better believe it is, right? But it also means that, well, is Saul going to be happy about that? Is Saul going to do a little reverse Benjamin of what we saw in Judges to whoever that new king is? Quite possibly. Now, we don't know for sure, but whenever we read things like, the people came out trembling and asked, "Do you come in peace?" that very well could be the political backdrop of people being worried that Samuel's going to make a big public event of anointing someone, and then that causes an intertribal war or a civil war, right? But Samuel says, "I come peaceably," and it seems like from this point on, everything is done behind closed doors. That Samuel's going specifically into the house of Jesse just with his family and going through the sons. But does God choose any of the older sons of Jesse? No, even though they kind of look the part, right? And in fact, Eliab is the first one that comes forward, and Samuel says, it's got to be this guy, right? Like, he looks like the warrior. He looks like Saul. And so, obviously, this is going to be the one that God brings forward. But God says, no. It's not him. I've rejected him. And then he says what? Don't look on the outside, because I'm not looking on the outside. I'm looking on the inside. And what is he looking for? His heart, and not just his heart, but a man after my own heart. He doesn't say it here, but he does say that in chapter 15. When Samuel is saying that the kingdom is going to be taken away from him, verse 28, and Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this very day and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. Moreover, the glory of Israel will not recant or change his mind. And so he's saying that this guy is going to be a better version of you. And what do we know means better in the book of Samuel? Based off of everything we've read, what does better mean in the eyes of the author of Samuel? Right, chapter 2. He's more humble and more obedient and more willing to submit to what God says, unlike Saul, who was the antithesis of all of that. So again, God chooses someone who on the outside, it looks just like a kid. But God's saying, no, I'm choosing someone who's going to live in accordance with chapter 2 instead of against chapter 2. And I'm going to choose the weak and lowly to be brought up and be made king. All right, so that's the backdrop of what we read in chapter 16. And now we get to chapter 17, skipping ahead of a little, to chapter 17. And so what were some of your answers to these questions? And Aaron, if there are any online that typed in any answers, I'd love to hear them, but okay. How about question number 1? Did Saul know David? He knew the family, but he didn't know him. Okay? Any other answers? Sort of, you said, Peggy? Okay, very good. So this is an interesting part. For those in line, they are saying that at the end of chapter 16, David is brought into play the lyre for Saul. Why? Okay, but why? Right, because there's an evil spirit from whom? From God. God has sent an evil spirit to torment Saul, which, by the way, means that God sends evil spirits to torment people. That's interesting to think about. Well, hold on. Let me finish sussing out Peggy's and Scott's answer. So we have the story of him being brought in because Bethlehem and Benjamin. Bethlehem is it's like 9 miles to Jerusalem, from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, and then it's probably another 10, 11 miles from Jerusalem to the heartland of Benjamin. So we're talking about 20 miles away, which is a good walk, but it's also not like forever away. It's a day or two journey, maybe. And so they're looking for someone who's a talented musician, and we find out that David is that person. So he comes in, and anytime that Saul is plagued by this evil spirit, David would play and would soothe him and comfort him. Now, do you think that Saul would know David's name if he was the one who was saving him by playing his music? No? Right. He also made him his armor bearer, which means he's the guy who walks around carrying the weapons so you don't tire yourself out until you need it, and then you hand over the sword, and then the guy goes and fights, right? So he's the armor or shield bearer or sword bearer. We're not entirely sure what that is. So in 16, it says that David has these two pretty important roles. But then in 17, at the end of 17, Saul kind of acts like he has no idea who David is. So why is that? Right, so one answer, Peggy said, is that he didn't bother to know who he was. He wasn't important enough to make note of that. Right, so that's one answer. Is there a time span? Well, so that's a good point. We don't know the time between chapter 16 and chapter 17. We don't know how big a distance chronologically that is. So maybe the answer is, well, yeah, he knew him at one point, but he forgot him, right? Right, or he's grown up. Yeah. Well, we know he's not too much older because in the story of David and Goliath, how old is David? Well, not necessarily. Right, so they call him a boy. He's actually called a young man, but just barely, right? Which means young man is how old? When do you become a man? 13. So he's probably a teen, right? So think like high schooler, yeah, we'll say high schooler. So he's somewhere in there. And so we don't know how old he was when he was anointed, right? He was somewhere in there, but he could have been 6, out caring for the people, or out caring for the sheep. But we just don't know. Yeah. Possibly. So is Saul feigning ignorance? Would be the answer, that he's pretending like he doesn't really know who this is. That could be an answer. Hmm. Okay. So the roles that he had were less significant as a kid, but after he kills Goliath, then he becomes like someone a need-to-know person, right? Well, these are all really good answers, and the answer is we don't really know. Another answer, which is a little bit more technical answer, is that these could be chronologically out of order. So remember, these books, these stories were compiled from oral tradition. It's not like these were written down at the time. They were oral traditions that the original authors of the books were pulling from a bunch of different traditions and putting them together. We talked a little bit about that with the Torah, in seeing that there are different authors or different traditions that were pulled together to construct these books by the original authors. And so this could be an example of that. And we'll see another example of that a little bit later on, when Saul tries to kill David with a spear. It could be that the author is pulling on and he didn't really know how to rectify these two stories, or how they fit together, and so he just gave one and then he gave the other. And he said, I'm not going to worry about trying to rectify them, we're just going to keep moving. So it could be that. It could be a lot of those answers we just don't really know. But that's important to realize, is that we're working with stories that don't give us all of the details, and some things don't necessarily make sense or smooth out. If you are looking for a perfect story chronologically that fits and every piece is accounted for and every question is answered, well, the Bible is not the book for you. There are a lot of loopholes that are left as we read through. And I believe that God works through the loopholes, and I believe that it's those things that God actually uses to draw us in, because there's nothing human beings like more than solving puzzles, right? Or working out problems. And so personally, I think that, again, we believe that the scriptures are inspired by God, that God was working through his Spirit to craft these. And I think the Spirit of God allowed that two separate traditions to be left in and didn't synthesize them, so that people would be enticed to dig in and to read and to discuss and to argue with one another about what really happened or why this happened. Because Well, you all just saw how interesting it is when just a very simple question is asked to say, well, wait a minute, what is it? This doesn't make any sense, right? So that's an important thing as we read through is we might not get all the answers, and that might be part of the point too. All right, so we're not entirely sure. It's up for debate whether Saul knows David in the story of David and Goliath. Moving on to question number 2. Why did David reject the sword of Saul? Okay, so the answer is it was cumbersome, and he wasn't used to it because it was cumbersome. All right? Other answers? Mm-hmm. Okay, so your answer is that David felt more comfortable with a sling and a stone, and so if he's going to go out and fight a battle, you're going to want to go with what you're the most comfortable with. Okay? Okay, I haven't tested them. Now that's interesting because that's a different answer than it was cumbersome. How many of you have something along the lines of it was cumbersome or weighed him down in your Bibles? A couple of you? How many of you said it was untested? Okay. And then how many of you have I wasn't used to them? Raise your hands. All right, so it's a pretty even smattering about that. That's really interesting, isn't it? That we don't really know how to translate that. Yeah, Beth. Oh, so the question is Saul actually doing some propaganda by outfitting David in his own armor so that he can say, if David wins, well, I had a say in that. I had not thought about that. That is very interesting. That might be the case. I don't know. Like I said, I've never thought about that, but I like how you're starting to get into the mind of Saul. I love it. So here's a question. Did the Israelite army have swords? Uh-huh. Excellent job. Excellent. I was wondering if anybody would remember that. So if we go back to chapter 13, this is after Saul becomes king. This is chapter 13, verse 19. Now there was no smith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, blacksmith, that is. For the Philistines said, the Hebrews must not make swords or spears for themselves. So all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen their plowshares, mattocks, axes, or sickles, their grain and harvesting material. The charge was 2/3 a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes for the setting of goads. So on the day of the battle, neither sword nor spear was found in the possession of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and his son Jonathan had them. So obviously this is a little bit earlier on. There are a lot of battles that take place, and as part of the plunder, swords and weaponry would have been part of the booty that you would have taken. But who would those swords and spears have gone to? Which leaders? Saul's leaders. Who was Saul making leaders, by the way? Who was his main commander? Abner, very good. And who was Abner in relationship to Saul? His cousin. So Saul is making his family the leaders, which makes sense, right? Because do you want a lot of other tribes' family members at the head of your army? Whenever you're worried about possible insurrection and things like that? No, right? So, who probably has this? Well, the standing army that Saul keeps with him in Benjamin, yes, but do the rest of the Israelites? Do the Bethlehemites who joined Saul's army have weapons? Most likely not. Has David ever held a sword before? Leaving out to the side of questioning whether he was an armor bearer or not, right? Before or after this story? Most likely not. And so when David says, I'm not used to it, like I always go back to VeggieTales because that's what I grew up with. And with VeggieTales, it's like you have Junior Asparagus and he's just in a tin can of armor and he's so burdensome that he falls over, he can't do anything in it. And so like in my mind, and this is often how we teach our kids, right? It's like, well, he was just a boy, right? He was a young kid, and so he couldn't wield this. Except we're talking about, well, yeah, he's a teenager, but he's a teenager who had enough strength to throw a stone to kill someone, right? Like, he's obviously got some girth to him. We were watching the Tri-Way football game, and like, yeah, some high schoolers, even freshmen, can be strong guys. And we know that he's out in the fields, and not only that, what's he doing fighting out in the fields? What's he fighting out in the fields? Right, and he's ripping them apart, right? Now, obviously, the Spirit of God is coming upon him, but this is a fit guy. And so I think that it's less likely that, like, he was just some weak kid. He's like, oh, I can't carry it. It's like, no. It's just that he had no interactions with any kind of weapons like that because most of Israel didn't at this point. And so it's like, here's a sword. Well, okay, but, like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, obviously, the pointy end in the bad guy, right? But other than that, like, there's no parrying or anything like that. If I go up against a fully armored guy with something that I don't know how to use, like, I'm toast, right? So, again, we're not 100% sure, but there are clues within the text that help us to piece together what is actually going on behind the scenes, which may actually challenge some of our preconceived notions about how this story plays out. Right? All right, moving on. Number 3, what happens if Israel loses? Oh, sorry, you had a question from behind. Sorry. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. Remember, again, this is just me personally pulling on Scripture to kind of fill in that question, because the answer is I don't know. But the one thing that we know about the Benjaminites from the story in Judges, what were they known for? What? Well, okay, violence, yeah. But it says in our story from Judges, again with the Civil War and the wiping out, that the Benjaminites were expert slingers. They could take the hair off a man from 30 paces or something like that without harming him, right? So we're given this very specific thing. So I don't know about going out with swords, but it might be delegitimizing if you have a kid from Benjamin coming up and showing up from Judah, from Bethlehem, coming up and showing the renowned slingers of Benjamin with his slingshot skills. By the way, when we're saying slingshot, we're not talking like little things. We're talking, and we have archaeological evidence of this, that the rocks they were throwing were like baseball-sized rocks. And these things could get going at 60, 70 miles an hour when they were thrown. So imagine a baseball-sized rock coming at you at 60 miles an hour. That's going to do some damage, right? So I don't know about the sword thing, but the sling thing might play into that. I don't know if that, again, that's something that I hadn't necessarily thought about until you brought it up, but it could be a subtext in there. I feel like you burned it on that. No, I'll let you do it. Yep. Right. Right. Hmm. Okay, so that's two questions. Um, so I'm going to try to summarize for people online quickly. So the first question was, is it intentional that we have the anointing of David and the Spirit of God coming upon him, and then immediately after the Spirit of God leaving Saul so that he was tormented by an evil spirit? The answer is absolutely yes. Obviously, the author is trying to make a connection that the Spirit of God was upon Saul and anointed him to be leader, but then it was promised that that was going to be taken away, and that was the beginning of that process, was God's Spirit being taken away and given to someone else. The second question was, does God's Spirit not being a part of the world order like we think about at Pentecost, where God's Spirit came upon the whole church, part of the reason why the ancient world was so brutal and violent? And like I don't know the mind of God, and I'm not outside of history, so I can't really answer, but I would lean towards no, simply because like humans are brutal regardless of what time. Like we think about this, but we've got plenty. Like we had 2 world wars in the last century. So like human violence and depravity is not a new thing, and it's still certainly happening. Like if you look about like the raping of Nanking or Unit 731 with the Japanese, or you think about things that happen in Africa, Rwanda, like there is no short supply of human atrocities, whether it's here or in the modern age. And we have the benefit of God's Spirit being upon us. So we like to... it's easy to kind of take these stuff and say, well, this is just Old Testament stuff, but I don't know. I just don't buy that. I think that's just human stuff. But we are going to keep moving because we've got to keep moving. So let's talk about what happens if Israel loses. So this battle is taking place where? The Valley of Elah. Now, if you remember from our geography of the Holy Lands, there are kind of 3 regions on the western side of Israel. There are the coastal plains where the Philistines are, nice and flat and fertile with lots of trade right off next to the coast, lots of rain. And then you have the Shephelah, which is the rolling hills, and then you have the Judean mountains, which is where Jerusalem and all these things are up way in the mountains, thousands of feet above sea level. And we talked about how the foothills, or the Shephelah, is the avenue to get up in, and how the Israelites are always trying to push down through these foothills to capture the coast, and the Philistines are always trying to push up through these foothills to get a stronghold up in the mountains, because then you can move much easier north and south than it is to move east and west. Okay? So the Valley of Elah, and I'm sorry I don't have a map for you today, but is in one of these corridors that lead right up into the mountains. And guess where it comes out? He comes right out at the city of Bethlehem, which is why we have Jesse sending his 3 oldest sons to go and fight. That's important because do you send your 3 oldest sons to fight the war of a king? Well, maybe if there's like a great call to arms. We see that in some of the other stories with Saul, but we don't have any call to arms like that here. Probably because Saul's actually established himself. He doesn't need to call to arms because he's got a big enough standing army. And so why would you send your 3 oldest sons, who, by the way, are the most important, because they're the ones who are, the oldest son's the one who's going to inherit and carry on the family name and be in charge of everything, right? So you're sending your top 3 most valuable assets into battle. The only reason you would do that is because you might be facing some sort of existential threat. And I believe that is what's happening here. So think about the insults that David and Goliath throw at each other. What do they say to one another? Okay, so that's him. That's him saying that let's sort this one on one. And by the way, when he's saying let's fight this one on one, is he really saying let's just like duke it out one on one and see who it is? Well, probably not, because that would be a silly way to do a fight, especially when you have a stronger army. What is really being said there is we're going to have a one-on-one fight where our gods are really the ones fighting. We talked about this again, where ancient battles were really divine battles, where you would have the gods of Gath, who is who? Who? No. Who is the god of Gath? Dagon. Very good. Remember from the story with the Ark of the Covenant? Because it went from Gath to Ekron to whatever the other city was. I'm blanking. But anyway, it's not important. And so it's really a showdown between Dagon and Yahweh. And what this one-on-one battle isn't just like, oh, who can be the greatest? Even though that obviously plays in. Like, they're not sending the scrawny kid from the Philistines to go fight. They're sending their most powerful warrior. But part of that is also because Dagon is a powerful warrior, and he's going to give me the battle. And so if I win, that really means that Dagon is more powerful here, that he has either has home field advantage or is stronger. Because again, this is in the in-between. We're not really sure who has home field advantage. Does Yahweh have home field advantage? Does Dagon? It's unclear because it's that borderland. And so this is actually a divine showdown, which is also why David's incensed about him, because he's calling out not the people of Israel, but he's actually calling out the God of Israel and saying that my God is stronger than your God and will give me the victory. And all the Israelites are cowards for not standing up and saying, no way, our God's more powerful and we're going to show you why, right? But, pardon me? Yeah, and how does he threaten him? Right. So he says, I'm going to give your flesh to the wild birds and the animals. Why is that a threat? I mean, obviously it's a threat that I'm going to kill you, but it's not just that. There's more going on. Exactly. Very good. So in the ancient world, after battles happened, then usually the women of or your family members would come and search the battlefield to see if they could find your body, and then they would go and bury you with your ancestral home. You'll notice that they always talk about where they bury people, because that's important. You're buried in your home, on your land, with your family. And so, with Goliath saying, the birds of the air are going to eat your flesh, what he's really saying is there's going to be no one left to bury you. Either we're going to kill them or enslave them. Your entire family, your entire tribe is going to be wiped out. That's really the threat that's going on behind the birds and the beasts there. And David does the same thing, right? He turns around and says, no, I'm going to do that to you. That there's going to be no one left to bury you. So what's at stake is, well, like all of Israel or all of Bethlehem could have been wiped out. And possibly more than that, because again, once you get up into the mountains, it's very easy to move north and south. That could have been a huge loss to the nation of Israel. All right, and finally, number 4. What are the political ramifications of David winning? So that's part of it. So Judah, through David, wins some renown, right? Because David becomes a war hero. And so that not only reflects on him, but it also reflects on his clan and his tribe. What else? Right, so it was a huge victory for the people of Israel at the hands of who? Of David. Now, remember, it is sort of Saul's victory, but remember, why was Saul made king? Not just to win battles, to do that, but to lead the army, to be the one on the forefront who leads the army and wins battles, right? To be that guy. But he didn't, right? He didn't even use his sword. It was some punk kid with a rock that was that guy. And we see the ramifications towards the end of that. So this is in chapter 18. So Saul takes David into his army and makes him a commander. And David keeps going out on missions and winning all the time. Such that, this is chapter 18, verse 7, or verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the woman came out of all of the towns of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? Now, why would Saul say that? Just because someone gets a little bit more attention than him? He has their hearts. And remember, Saul was made king to be that guy. But now David's that guy. With rumors, by the way, that God's going to tear the kingdom away from him. And we see this later on. Again, just going down a few verses in chapter 18 to verse 15. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David. Why? For it was he who marched out and came in leading them. And so this is the setup for the antagonism that Saul has against David, because it's all tied into the political nature of the kingship, of what the king was there to do, and the purpose of Saul being there, and why David became such a threat was because the Spirit of God was upon him, and David was being obedient. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to look at some of my favorite things, well, we'll talk about them real briefly. So, what were the rewards for whoever killed Goliath, according to Saul? What did Saul say? All right, so his daughter in marriage, Michal, right? What? No more taxes. Glory and riches, right? Those are the three. But, so, I love the no taxes just because I'm more of a libertarian and that appeals to me. But it's also interesting to think about, were there taxes before Saul? No? So we have this interesting dynamic of, Saul's living into all of the things that Samuel warned the people about. Remember, he said he's going to take all the best stuff. And we actually see that starting to play out. It's a real short phrase, but we know that at this point in Saul's reign, which is a number of years at this point, that it's developed to the point where Saul is now enacting taxes, maybe not on all of Israel, but at least on the region of Benjamin and Judah, right? So that's interesting. He also promises Michal, his daughter. Is that his oldest daughter? No, that's a younger daughter, which is important because political marriages were a very important thing. And so he offers his younger daughter, who is still important. You get to become the son-in-law of the king, but not the most important because it's not the firstborn, the one that would have the closest connection, which we see later on, because does Saul offer his oldest daughter to David? Yes. Where does he do that? Right, so chapter 18, verse 17. Then Saul said to David, here is my eldest daughter, Meribah. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. So why might Saul do that? No. Why is Saul offering his daughter? What? Well, not that daughter, though. Not that daughter. Okay. So the answer back here was essentially keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And so maybe this is a way of drawing him in and keeping an eye. And that certainly could be the case, right? Because by becoming the son-in-law, now you're more tied to the tribe of Benjamin than you would have been before. But he also continues on, for Saul thought, I will not raise my hand against him. Let the Philistines deal with him. So that's interesting, that by marrying his daughter, he's actually hoping that more of a target will be put on his back, actually to raise him to fame in order to get him knocked down by his enemies, right? But David said to Saul, who am I and who are my kinsfolk that my father's family in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law of the king? But at the time when Saul's daughter Merab should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Meholeth as a wife. So, why did David say what he said? Is it because he's so humble? Maybe. There are some of those things playing on the background, but he does end up marrying Michal in the same section, right? So I actually think what's going on is the bride price was too much to pay. So a bride price would have been money that the groom's family would have paid essentially to buy the bride, because women were currency in a lot of ways in the ancient world. And so if you lose your daughter and you're giving a dowry, you're losing a pretty big investment, right? Not to mention all the food that you've given to like raise this daughter and to keep her healthy. But now she's marrying you instead of somebody else. And so you're losing a lot of essentially trading capital. I hate to say it in that way, but that is how the ancient world was. And so you would pay a bride price, essentially money or some other investment to get the woman and her dowry, right? And so I think that in David saying, "Who am I?" is not who am I is that I'm not that important, but we don't have that much stuff. Like, what are we going to give you to have your first daughter as a wife? We can't afford that. We see that again with Michal just later on. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Saul was told this, and it pleased him. And Saul thought, let me give her to him that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Again, same rationale. Therefore, Saul said to David a second time, You shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, Speak to David in private and say to him, See, the king is delighted with you, and all the servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants reported these things to David in private, and David said, Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I'm a poor man and of no repute? But the servants of Saul told him, This is what David said. And Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, The king desires no marriage present or a bride price, except 100 foreskins of Philistines, and that he may be avenged on the king's enemies. Now Saul plans to make David fall by the hands of the Philistines. So he's setting, again, David up, even in trying to win the hand of Michal, to get killed, right? But does he get killed? No. So he sets up this price, bring me 100 penises. And David says, I'll do you even better. And he brings a bag of 200 penises and drops them at his father-in-law's feet. I love that story, but just because it's funny on one level, but it's also showing that there's a lot of political maneuvering, right? This is some crazy stuff, and like shots in the dark and backstabbing and maneuvering to try to get what you want, and having a nice, wonderful face. Look, you're pleasing and everybody loves you. Come into the family, while we're also trying to kill you off, right? Now, we don't usually see a lot of that, but that is indeed what's going on. This is a very chaotic, traumatic time in the land of Israel. All right, we have run out of time, so we don't get to go into a lot of, obviously, we're going to talk more about David running around and Saul trying to kill him. By the way, I did mention an instance of maybe two different traditions. We have Saul trying to pin David to the wall with his spear, right? And he does it twice, and David dodges both times. And then, like the next chapter, we have almost the exact same story repeated. Is that because it happened twice? Well, maybe, but it also could be two different oral traditions that are being put, and they didn't know if they were separate or not, and so they just stuck them both in because they didn't want to take out an important story as they were compiling the history. So we don't have enough time to get into that, but that's another example of an instance where we're not entirely sure what's going on, but it very likely could be that there are different stories that just aren't being smoothed over and just kind of said, nope, here it is, you all work it out, right? But I do want to briefly talk about what happened at the end of our reading. So in chapter 21, Saul is like directly out to kill David. Like he's sending his own men to go and assassinate his political rival. And that's what's happened. That is an assassination attempt at David's house. And so his wife, who loves him, Michal, finds out about it and helps him escape. He goes to the priest to get some food, and actually it seems like he actually tricks the priest into getting what he needs. And that begins his running around in the wilderness, and even going and serving as a double agent for the Philistines, and pretending that he's gone mad by like drooling down his face so that the king of Gath, which by the way is where Goliath is from, doesn't kill him, right? So it's all of these interesting things. But in chapter 22, after they escape from Gath, he says that, verse 1, David left there and escaped to the cave of Adullam, where his brothers and all of his father's house heard of it. They went down to him. Everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered around him, and he became captain over him. Those who were with him numbered about 400. And this is where I want to end. One, because it's a great place to end. This is actually possibly where some of our old stories of Robin Hood originated in the British Isles. Very well could have been pulling from this, because you've got David hiding out in a cave with a bunch of his stinky merry men who were the people who should have been in like debtor's prison, or who out to get him because they owed money or because they were discontented. All of these low lives, right? And David's bringing them in and acting kind of like a father to them, giving them unity and purpose as they fight for him. But what also is he actually doing? He's raising a standing army, which is a clear act of rebellion against the king, who is also out to kill him. But the reason why I want to end with this is you have your handouts here, and if you didn't get one, they're on the table back here. This actually comes from a webinar series that I went to with Dr. Todd Bolin, who is with the Jerusalem University College, my alma mater. And so David wrote a number of the Psalms. He actually wrote 75, so that's half of the Psalms are attributed to David. He also might have written more, but 75 were attributed to him specifically, which again goes back to the fact that, yeah, he was a talented musician, so much so that he was the one brought from out of town to play for King Saul. And so he's a talented musician, and he's writing these. And I just want to draw your attention. So I've taken these, and these are the ones with specific superscription. So if you look in the book of Psalms, and if you have your Bibles, you can open up. We're going to look at Psalm 34 specifically here. A superscription is, if you look here in the Bible, in my Bible, it is Psalm 34, and then in italics, it has praise for deliverance from trouble. And then the Psalms, and then underneath that, it has text, and it says on Psalm 34, of David, when he feigned madness before Abimelech, so that he drove him out and he went away. So that's the superscription, that little detail, historical detail. Those are all throughout the Psalms. They give a little bit of context that are there. I happen to believe that they're original to the Psalm. Not all scholars think. Some scholars think that those were added on much, much, much later. But I happen to think that they are actually historical and original to the Psalms. But you have the Psalm here. You have the most likely context within Scripture, so you can look up what was happening when that psalm was written, and then the superscription is there on the side. So this is a reference for you. And I would encourage you, as we're kind of working through and as we get to the scriptural references, to actually go look up the psalms that David was writing, because you kind of get a sense of what is going through his head and where his soul and spirit are at different times. But I want to read specifically from Psalm 34, which... so this is after feigned madness and was driven away. Now, it doesn't quite line up because Abimelech is the high priest who helps him out, and he feigns madness with the king of Gath. So that's a little bit weird. We're not going to get into the details of how to rectify that because I don't think it's as important. But this is lined up when he is out in Adullam, and he's with his men, these outcasts, these nobodies, these people who are men who are looking for a purpose, maybe looking for a leader in all of this. And this is a song that he wrote while he was in the cave, okay? And here he is. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Again, he's writing this in a cave, most likely with a bunch of low lives at the lowest point probably in their lives, because they're out living in caves with some guy. And he's saying, let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. And you can see David in a cave with these downtrodden men singing songs with them to bolster their spirits. And he's literally saying to these humble men, hear and be glad, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. He's teaching these songs as salves to these men. I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Look at him and be radiant, so your faces shall never be ashamed. Spoken to people who are quite literally ashamed that they've run away. This poor soul cried out and was heard by the Lord and was saved from every trouble. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and deliver him. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Happy are those who take refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his holy ones. For those who fear him have no want. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Come, O children, and listen to me. I will teach you of the fear of the Lord. Which of you desires life and covets many days to enjoy good? Again, you can imagine him in the cave saying, how many of you seek these things? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Again, Samuel chapter 2. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and rescues them from all their trouble. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord rescues them from them all. He keeps all their bones, not one of them will be broken. Evil brings death to the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. It's really beautiful stuff when you think about the context of David rising up to be this leader, but not just like a great military leader, but really a father to these young men, to give them purpose. And so I would encourage you as we kind of work through to keep coming back to the Psalms. The Psalms are things that we often just say, oh, well, it's like nice poetry, but many of them are written in a time and place. In fact, it's very interesting if you want to read and compare like 142, which is probably written towards the beginning of him being in the cave of Adullam, you know what I'm saying, as opposed to Psalm 34, which was most likely written towards the end. And you can see even the development of David's psyche as he's wrestling with his own being driven from his family, forced to live in caves, fearing for his life, and developing into this leader as more and more people are coming to him, and he's given the opportunity to rise up to the occasion. So I hope that you'll read the Psalms in conjunction with what we're doing. But we are out of time, a lot out of time. And so for next week, we are going to read chapters, we're we ended with chapter 23, so we're going to read chapters 24 through the end of 1 Samuel. So 24 through 31 is our chunk for next week, and we're going to see the complete rise of David and the fall of Saul and the aftermath of all of that. But keep these Psalms as a reference guide for you, and see if you learn anything new about the Psalms as you're reading them in conjunction with what's going on in David's life. I will stick around for questions. I know we didn't get an opportunity to do that, but I do want to be respectful of people's time and respectful of the blessed souls that are watching our children over in the activity center. So, with all of that said, is there anybody who'd be willing to close us in a word of prayer tonight? Thanks, God. Amen. And one final thing, if you're joining us online, again, it's really helpful if you put in the chat or in the comments that you're here. We're just trying to keep track of the attendance here, so that's, well, it's mostly for me, so do me a favor and do that. I would appreciate that. But God bless you all, and we'll see you next week. And if anybody has any questions, we can stick around for that. Yes, Steve. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so that's a really good question, because the Philistines kind of become a perpetual challenge to Israel. It's important to remember about the Philistines. We think about them as like one big block, because again, that's how we think of countries. But at this point, the Philistines, yeah, they were a loose confederation, but they were actually city-states. So they were the five primary cities: Gath, Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and oh, you guys pay me to know this stuff. I don't remember. But there's these five major cities, and each of them have their own lords. And so when it says that he went out and they wiped out the Philistines, it probably, in any place that you read that, isn't talking about the entire nation. It's probably talking about one of these city-states that was grasping for more political power. And all of the things that we read about, like political maneuvering and things, was happening everywhere else. This was common in the ancient world. And so even among the Philistines, this was happening to grasp for power and to have more wealth and influence among the different cities. And so I think it was Samson in Gath? Did he tear down the temple in Gath? I'm trying to remember. Let's go back. So again, we're in the book of Judges. It's towards the end of Judges. Samson's death. Now the Lord of the Philistines gathered to worship their Dagon. No, it doesn't say that there. I think it says it earlier. How can you say I love you? Blah, blah, blah. Gaza. Yeah, Gaza. So again, that's one particular city that they brought him to. So when he's bringing down this temple, he's not bringing down, like, it's not like all the Philistines are there. It's probably just the high-ranking nobles of the city of Gaza. Like Ekron's not there, Gath isn't there, Ashkelon isn't there. None of that is involved. And so that's an important thing as we're thinking about more regional conflicts. Even people coming up, they ran back to, when David killed Goliath, where did they run back to? Well, they ran back to Gath, because that's where they were from. And so it was most likely Gath. I think there was another city also mentioned. So it might have been a joint effort. But were all of the Philistines there? Most likely not. It was a conjoined effort of these two city-states going and trying to fight against the Israelites. So I think that's kind of an important aspect to remember as we're reading through that, is these conflicts are not as straightforward as we might just read right off of the page because of all of these political things that are going on at the time. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's why you can have like maybe the complete destruction of a city, or at least a tearing down of important populace of that without the entire people of the Philistines being eradicated, right? Hmm. Right. Hmm. Right, and that would have been pretty devastating for that particular city, but the other 5 cities would have been just fine. In fact, they would have been better off because they would have then siphoned political power, influence, trade routes, things like that from the city of Gaza. Very good. Any other questions? I know we covered a lot and we also skipped over a whole lot. All right, well, as always, if you think of something, email me, come into my office, talk, or bring it back next week, and we can also cover it next week. But I would encourage you, we are going to pay special attention to chapters 24, 25, and 26. So if you find your place where you can't read it all, I think you're lying. You should have time to read the scriptures. But if that's the case, at least read those 3 chapters, because that's where we're going to focus most of our time for next week, is on those 3 chapters. But yep, I'll see you all next week. Thank you all very much.